In the vast, unforgiving heart of the Dakota Territory, a wedding dress, white as bone, hung limp in a half-finished cabin. It was meant to be the start of Adelaide Callahan's life, but the groom never came. Left with nothing but a cruel letter and the hollow echo of broken promises, she was a ghost in her own future. But destiny moves in strange, violent currents. One blood-red sunset, a sound tore through her solitude, not the whisper of the wind, but the snarl of hungry wolves, and the terrified cry of a child. That single cry would change everything. The silence was the cruelest part. It had settled over the small two-room cabin, like a shroud, thick and suffocating. For 3 days, Adelaide Callahan had existed within it, moving from the single window to the cold hearth and back again. The wedding dress, a fine muslin thing her mother had stitched with hopeful hands, still hung from a wooden peg on the wall. It was a mocking spectre, its pristine white a stark contrast to the mud-caked hem of her own work dress. Jasper Kane was supposed to have arrived a week ago. Then a letter came, not with him, but carried by a freight driver from Redemption, the nearest dusty settlement, some 10 miles west. The paper was crisp, the handwriting elegant and dismissive. His venture in the silver mines of Colorado had paid off beyond his wildest dreams, he'd written. A woman of her simple station would no longer be suitable. He wished her well a final cutting pleasantry before the signature that had once made her heart flutter. He even left her the half-built cabin and the patch of unforgiving land, a parting gift that felt more like a cage. Adelaide had read it once, her hands trembling. Then she had crumpled it and fed it to the flames in the hearth. But the words were seared into her memory. Simple station. She was the daughter of a preacher, educated and gentle, but without wealth or title. She had believed Jasper when he spoke of love, of building a life from the prairie soil with their own 2 hands. Now she saw the truth. She had been a placeholder, a dalliance, until something better came along. The wind howled outside, a lonely, keening sound that mirrored the ache in her chest. It was a late autumn wind, carrying the first real bite of the coming winter. Her supplies were meager, a sack of flour, some beans, salted pork and coffee. Enough for a month if she was careful. Jasper had promised to stock the larder upon his return. Another lie. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared out the window. The sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the vast rolling plains in hues of orange and violent purple. It was a beautiful, desolate landscape. She was utterly alone, a tiny speck, in an immense, indifferent wilderness. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the town of Redemption had offered her little more than curious, pitying stares when she'd bought her initial supplies. As dusk deepened, a new sound pricked her ears sharp and menacing, rising above the whistle of the wind. A wolf's howl. Then another closer this time. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. She'd heard them at a distance before, but this was different. This was a hunting pack, and they were near. She checked the door, sliding the heavy wooden bar into place. Her father had taught her to shoot, but the rifle Jasper had left was heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. She checked its load, the metallic click echoing in the silent cabin. Suddenly a different sound cut through the air, a high-pitched cry. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. Adelaide's blood ran cold. She pressed her ear to the rough-hewn door, listening. The snarling of the wolves grew more frantic, punctuated by that single terrified scream. It couldn't be. No one should be out here, especially not a child. It had to be a trick of the wind, a phantom born of her own loneliness. But then it came again, closer and more desperate, a raw cry of terror. Without a second thought, the desolation in her heart was replaced by a fierce protective instinct. She grabbed the heavy rifle, her knuckles white on the stock, and fumbled with the bar on the door. To open it was madness. She was one woman against a pack of wolves. But to leave a child to that fate was unthinkable. She flung the door open. The scene that met her eyes was a nightmare etched in the fading twilight. Not 30 yards from her cabin, a small boy no older than 7 or 8 was backed against a cluster of rocks. He wore buckskin leggings, and his black hair was long and loose. He was clearly Lakota. A circle of grey, shadowy forms closed in on him. 5 no 6 wolves, their eyes gleaming like malevolent embers. One of them lunged, and the boy swung a fallen branch, his cry a mixture of fear and defiance. Adelaide didn't aim. She didn't have time. She lifted the rifle, pointed it at the sky, and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening. It ripped through the twilight, a crack of thunder that sent birds scattering from the nearby cottonwoods. The wolves, startled by the sudden violent noise, flinched back. They paused, their snarling, momentarily silenced their heads, turning toward the cabin. "Get back! Get away!" Adelaide screamed, her voice hoarse. She worked the lever action, chambering another round. The motion was clumsy, frantic. The wolves hesitated, eyeing the boy, then the source of the gunshot. The alpha, a huge, dark-furred beast, took a half-step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. "I said get," she yelled, taking a step out onto the porch. She wasn't a hunter. She was a preacher's daughter who knew more of scripture than shotguns. But in that moment, seeing the terror in the boy's wide, dark eyes, she was as fierce as any mother bear. The alpha's nerve broke. The unnatural sound of the gunshot was too much of a threat. It turned, and with a flick of its tail, the pack melted back into the tall prairie grass, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Silence descended once more, broken only by the ragged sound of Adelaide's own breathing. The boy was still pressed against the rocks, his small body trembling. His eyes were fixed on her, wide with shock. She saw then that his arm was bleeding a dark gash where one of the wolves had gotten close. Slowly she lowered the rifle. "It's all right," she said, her voice softer now, though it still shook. "They're gone. You're safe." The boy didn't move. He watched her with an unnerving stillness, his gaze wary and intense. He didn't understand her words. "Come here," she urged, gently gesturing toward the cabin. "Let me see to your arm." "It's cold." He remained frozen. Adelaide took a hesitant step toward him, then another. She set the rifle down on the porch, showing him her empty hands. When she was only a few feet away, his legs seemed to give out. He slid down the rock face and collapsed onto the ground in a small, still heap. Adrenaline gave way to a fresh wave of panic. She rushed forward, knelt beside him, and gently turned him over. His face was pale beneath his tanned skin, and his eyes were closed. He had fainted from fear or pain or both. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Adelaide gathered the small boy into her arms. He was light, but a dead weight. She staggered back to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind her, and laid him gently on her own narrow bed, the one that was supposed to have been her marriage bed. The cabin was a bubble of dim, flickering light against an ocean of darkness. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning around the corners of the building, but inside a tense quiet reigned. Adelaide worked by the light of a single tallow candle, her brow furrowed in concentration. The boy lay on her cot, his breathing shallow but steady. She had carefully cut away the sleeve of his buckskin shirt to reveal the wound. It was a nasty gash, deep and ragged from the calf to his elbow. The wolf's teeth had torn the flesh, and it was bleeding sluggishly. Her first task was to stop the bleeding. Her second, to prevent infection, a constant and deadly threat on the frontier. Her medical supplies were as sparse as her pantry. She had a small tin of carbolic salve, a few rolls of linen bandages, and a bottle of whiskey Jasper had left behind. Ripping a strip from one of her own clean petticoats, she poured a little of the fiery liquor onto it. "This is going to sting," she whispered more to herself than to the unconscious child. She gently but firmly dabbed at the wound. The boy flinched, a low moan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. His skin was hot to the touch. A fever was already setting in. After cleaning the gash as best she could, she applied a thin layer of the greasy, pungent salve and wrapped his arm tightly with the linen bandages. Throughout the process, she studied him. He was Lakota. That much was clear from his features, his dark hair, and the simple functional design of his clothes. A small medicine pouch was tied around his neck on a leather thong. He must have wandered from a hunting party or a migrating camp. But where were they? How had a child this young come to be alone at dusk in territory, prowled by wolves? She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. The rifle lay on the table, a stark reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. The abandoned bride, the jilted woman full of self-pity, had vanished. In her place was a guardian, a protector. The boy's vulnerability had ignited a part of her she hadn't known existed. Hours passed. She brewed some willow bark tea, a remedy her mother had sworn by for fevers, and when the boy stirred, she managed to get a few spoonfuls of the bitter liquid past his lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dark eyes occasionally fluttering open, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. He would stare at her, at the unfamiliar log walls, at the muslin dress on the peg before sleep reclaimed him. He never spoke a word. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long dancing shadows. Adelaide found herself watching the boy's chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm in the vast silence. Her own problems, her own heartbreak, seemed to shrink in the face of this small, breathing life she had pulled from the jaws of death. It was some time after midnight when she was startled from a light doze by a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the soft rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. Not one horse, but many. They were moving slowly, deliberately, not with the urgency of a pursuit, but with a heavy, inexorable tread. Her heart leapt into her throat. The boy's family. They had found him. She rushed to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the prairie in a wash of silver. What she saw made her breath catch. Horses. Dozens of them. They formed a wide, silent circle around her small cabin, their riders sitting tall and still as statues in the moonlight. They were warriors, their silhouettes unmistakable against the night sky. They held rifles across their laps and lances that pointed toward the stars. They were not making a threat, not yet. They were simply there, watching, waiting. Her cabin, her tiny island of solitude, was now the center of a silent, intimidating siege. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. They had tracked the boy here. What did they think? Did they believe she had harmed him, kidnapped him? In their eyes, she was a white woman, an outsider, and their child was injured inside her home. The story could be twisted in 1,000 terrifying ways. She backed away from the window, her hands trembling. She looked at the boy sleeping fitfully on her bed, then at the rifle on the table. One shot had saved him. Another might start a war she could not possibly survive. The thudding of hooves stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of held breath, of imminent action. They were out there, a ring of shadows in the moonlight, and she was in here with their son. She had no way of explaining, no way to make them understand. She could only wait for the sound of a footstep on her porch, for the rap of a fist on her door, that would decide her fate. The night stretched into an eternity. Adelaide sat frozen in her chair, her eyes darting between the sleeping boy and the door. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every sigh of the wind sounded like an approaching footstep. The silent ring of riders outside was an immense, terrifying pressure. She felt like a mouse in a trap, aware of the steel jaws, but uncertain when they would spring. She must have drifted into a state of exhausted stupor, because she was jolted awake by a change in the quality of the light. The first pale grey fingers of dawn were creeping through the window. With a deep, shuddering breath, she rose and dared to look outside again. They were still there. But the scene had changed. In the growing light, she could see them clearly. They were not a war party poised for attack. Several of the riders had dismounted and were tending to small, smokeless fires. Others were unpacking their horses. And around her cabin, in the very circle where the riders had sat guard all night, were things, piles of them. She squinted her mind, struggling to process what she was seeing. There were stacks of thick, luxurious buffalo robes and beaver pelts. There were bolts of colourful woven cloth and intricately beaded moccasins. Sacks of what looked like grain-dried meat hanging from newly erected racks, and even a live goat tethered to her porch railing, placidly chewing on a loose splinter of wood. It was not a siege. It was an offering. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a profound, heart-thumping bewilderment. She looked back at the boy. His fever seemed to have broken. His breathing was deeper, more regular. He was still asleep, but it was the sleep more of healing, not of crisis. A sharp, authoritative knock sounded at the door. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight of command. Adelaide's hands went to her apron, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. This was it. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she walked to the door and lifted the heavy bar. She pulled it open just a crack at first, then, seeing no immediate threat, opened it fully. Standing on her porch was a man who seemed to have been carved from the very rock of the plains. He was immense, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders as broad as the cabin door. His face was a mask of stern, weathered lines, his black hair braided with strips of otter fur. His eyes, dark and piercing, missed nothing. He was clearly the leader. Behind him stood several other men, their faces equally impassive, but their eyes were all fixed on her. The tall man's gaze swept past her into the cabin and settled on the form of the boy on the bed. A flicker of something relief, pain, gratitude crossed his face for a fraction of a second before the stoic mask returned. He spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. The language was Lakota, the words utterly foreign to her, but the tone was not hostile. He then gestured to the piles of goods surrounding her home. Adelaide could only shake her head, her own voice caught in her throat. I don't understand." One of the men behind the leader stepped forward. He was older, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He spoke this time in accented but clear English. "He is Matto," the older man said, nodding toward the leader. "Chief of our band," he says. "The gifts are for you, a payment for the life of his son." Adelaide stared, dumbfounded. "A payment? I couldn't possibly. I only did what anyone would do." Matto spoke again in Lakota, his eyes never leaving Adelaide's face. The translator listened, then said, "He says you faced the wolf pack alone. You fired the thunder stick. You took Hinto into your home and mended his broken flesh. You sat vigil while we watched from the darkness. This is not what anyone would do. This is the act of a brave heart. His son Hinto is his only child. His life is without price. But we offer what we have. It is the law of our people. A life for a life. You saved his, so we will protect yours." Adelaide was overwhelmed. She looked from Matto's unyielding face to the literal mountain of goods that now surrounded her home. It was more wealth than she had ever seen in her life. The furs alone were worth a small fortune. The food could last her and a dozen other families through the harshest winter. "Please," she stammered, feeling small and flustered under their intense scrutiny. "It is too much. You don't have to do this." Matto took a step forward, and Adelaide had to fight the urge to step back. He was an intimidating presence, radiating a quiet power that was both unsettling and magnetic. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes. He looked down at her, then spoke her language for the first time. His voice was even deeper, a gravelly baritone, the English words carefully, deliberately chosen. "The debt is paid," he said. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. "We stay until the boy is strong." He then turned without another word and strode back toward his men, his presence commanding their immediate and silent respect. Adelaide stood in her doorway, the cool morning air washing over her, and stared at the impossible scene. Her desolate cabin, the monument to her abandonment and loneliness, was now an island of astounding wealth, surrounded by a small army of Lakota warriors. The goat bleated softly. The man named Matto had not asked for permission to stay. He had simply informed her of his decision. Her solitary life had been shattered first by a boy and a wolf pack, and now by a giant of a man, and his humbling, terrifying gratitude. She had a home full of provisions, a yard full of riches, and a future that was suddenly bewilderingly no longer her own. The days that followed were a study in surreal coexistence. Matto's people set up a small, orderly camp, a respectable distance from the cabin, a cluster of teepees that seemed to sprout from the prairie soil overnight. They were a constant, quiet presence. Adelaide would see them tending to horses, tanning hides, or the women working with beads and quills, their movements efficient and graceful. They never approached her home uninvited, yet she felt their eyes on her constantly. She was under their protection, a status that felt both comforting and confining. Hinto recovered quickly under her care. The fever vanished and the color returned to his cheeks. Though his arm was still bandaged, he was soon sitting up, his dark, curious eyes following Adelaide's every move. The language barrier was a formidable wall between them, but they found other ways to communicate. She would point to an object, a cup, a spoon, the fire, and say the English word. He would listen intently, then repeat it in a soft, musical voice before saying the Lakota word in return. Wiyatke, Tukiha, Peta. A slow, fragile bridge of understanding was being built between them. Matto came to the cabin each morning and evening. He would stand just inside the door, a silent, towering figure, and watch as Adelaide changed Hinto's dressing or tried to coax the boy to eat some of the broth she'd made. He rarely spoke, but his presence filled the small room. His gaze was heavy, analytical. She felt he was measuring her, studying her every action, and for some reason, she found herself desperately wanting to meet his silent approval. One evening, he brought a small, carved wooden horse, its lines simple, but full of life. He handed it to Hinto, who accepted it with a rare, brilliant smile. Matto's stern features softened almost imperceptibly as he watched his son. In that moment, he was not the intimidating chief. He was just a father. "He is strong because of you," Matto said, his deep voice startling her. He looked at her, and his eyes held a depth of gratitude that went beyond the mountain of gifts outside. "He is a brave boy," Adelaide replied, her voice a little breathless. "He fought them. He has the heart of a bear." Matto said, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He then gestured to the nearly empty pot of broth on the hearth. This is not enough. A growing boy needs meat. The next morning, she found a freshly dressed deer carcass near her porch. The arrangement drew the inevitable attention of the town of Redemption. The first to arrive was Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a kind face and worried eyes. He rode up one afternoon, his gaze taking in the Lakota camp, the piles of goods, and the goat which Hinto had named Tokahea, or First. Miss Callahan Sheriff Brody said, tipping his hat as she stepped onto the porch. Just checking to see if everything is all right out here. His eyes betrayed his true meaning. He was checking to see if she was a prisoner. Everything is fine, Sheriff. More than fine, Adelaide said calmly. She explained the story, the wolves, the rescue, the boy. Brody listened, his expression shifting from suspicion to grudging respect. Well, I'll be, he muttered, looking toward the camp. That's Matto's band. They keep to themselves, mostly run a big ranching operation up on Stone Creek. Raise horses that are the envy of the territory. Matto, he's a hard man, but he's known to be fair. Still, this is an unusual situation. It's making folks in town nervous. His warning proved prophetic. When Adelaide next rode to Redemption for supplies, she couldn't find in her gifted larder, namely more carbolic solve, she was met with a wall of suspicion. Whispers followed her down the boardwalk. Women who had once offered her pity now looked at her with a mixture of fear and resentment. Living out there with them heathens, she heard Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, mutter to a friend. It ain't decent. Mr. Abernathy, the usually friendly mercantile owner, was curt and distant. Heard you came into some wealth, he said, his eyes narrowed as he counted her coins. The news of the gifts had clearly travelled, twisted by rumour, into something sordid. She was no longer just the abandoned bride. She was the Indian woman, an outcast twice over. The loneliness she had felt after Jasper's departure was a dull ache compared to this sharp, active shunning. Returning to the cabin that evening, her heart was heavy. She felt caught between two worlds belonging to neither. As she dismounted, Matto approached from his camp. The town is not friendly, he stated, his eyes reading the weariness on her face. They don't understand, she said, looking away toward the distant, dusty outline of Redemption. They do not need to, Matto said, his voice firm. You are protected here. Wikozane. She looked at him, questioning. It means safety, wholeness, wellness, he explained. My people will be your shield. The sincerity in his voice was a balm to her wounded spirit. He saw her not as a white woman or an outcast, but as the brave heart who had saved his son. Here in this strange camp, surrounded by people whose language she didn't speak, she felt a sense of belonging that the town of Redemption had never offered her. But as she looked from Matto's strong, determined face to the horizon, a new fear began to dawn. This peace, this fragile bridge between their worlds, was too good to last. The whispers in town were like sparks in dry grass, and she knew it would only take one more gust of wind to set the prairie ablaze. Hinto's arm healed, leaving a faint, silvery scar as a reminder of the night that had bound their lives together. He was a bright, energetic presence around the cabin, his initial silence replaced by a mix of Lakota chatter and the handful of English words Adelaide had taught him. He followed her everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. His laughter became a sound as familiar and welcome as the morning bird song. The Lakota camp remained. The initial reason for their stay, Hinto's recovery, was over, yet they made no move to leave. Adelaide found she was grateful. The quiet hum of their daily life was a comforting rhythm, a stark contrast to the hostile silence that greeted her from the direction of town. She learned the names of some of the women, like Winona, the older woman with kind eyes, who showed her how to prepare dried corn, and Kangji, a young warrior, who taught Hinto how to fletch an arrow. She and Mato fell into a routine of their own. They rarely had long conversations, but a deep unspoken communication grew between them. It was in the way he would watch her tend her small, struggling garden, or the way she would bring him a cup of hot coffee on a cool morning. He taught her to read the clouds to know when a storm was coming. She read to him from one of her father's books of poetry, and while she was sure he didn't understand all the words, he listened with a focused intensity that made her feel truly heard. She was beginning to see the man behind the formidable chief, a man of deep loyalties, quiet strength, and a surprising gentleness. This fragile peace was shattered on a blistering hot afternoon. A dust cloud on the horizon signaled an approaching rider, and it was not one of Mato's men. Adelaide's heart tightened with a familiar dread as a lone horseman drew closer. The rider was dressed in a fine tailored suit, a stark and incongruous sight in the rugged landscape. It was Jasper Kane. He dismounted with the same easy confidence she remembered his charming smile firmly in place. He took in the Lakota tipis with a flicker of distaste before his eyes landed on Adelaide, who stood frozen on her porch. "Addie, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "I came as soon as I could." Behind her, she was vaguely aware of a shift in the Lakota camp. The quiet hum ceased. Several of Mato's warriors, including Kangji, had risen to their feet, their expressions wary. "Jasper," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here? I came for you." "Of course," he said, stepping onto the porch, his expensive boots making a hollow sound. "My letter. It was a terrible mistake. A moment of madness. I was under enormous pressure. The silver claim was in jeopardy. I said things I never should have. I've been half out of my mind, with regret, ever since. I've come to make it right. To take you away from all this." He waved a dismissive hand at the camp and the cabin. He hadn't even noticed the piles of furs and goods. His eyes were only for her. Or so he wanted her to believe. Hinto, who had been playing by the side of the cabin, ran to Adelaide and hid behind her skirts, peering out at the stranger. Jasper's smile tightened at the sight of the boy. "What is this?" he asked, his tone hardening slightly. Before Adelaide could answer, a large shadow fell across the porch. Mato had emerged from his tipi and was now standing at the bottom of the steps. He said nothing, simply stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his presence a silent, immovable challenge. Jasper looked from Adelaide to Mato and back again, a slow, dawning comprehension on his face. He had clearly heard the rumors in town. "I see," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "So this is what you've been doing. I leave you for a few weeks and you take up with savages. Have you no shame, Adelaide?" The word savages hung in the air like a poison. Adelaide felt a hot surge of anger. "They have shown me more kindness and honor than you ever did," she retorted, her voice shaking with rage. "This is Mato. He and his people are my friends." Jasper laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Friends, Addie, be sensible. I heard in town you'd come into some kind of windfall. Don't tell me you believe these gifts come without a price. They're using you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Come with me now. We can be married in redemption by sunset. We'll leave this place, go to Denver. You'll have a proper house, fine dresses, servants, the life you were meant for." He reached for her hand. It was the moment of truth. The life he offered was the one she had once desperately wanted, a life of comfort, society, and acceptance. It was a return to the world she knew. But as he touched her, her skin crawled. His words were hollow, his promises tarnished. She looked past him at Matto's steady, waiting gaze. She saw the quiet strength that had guarded her, the honor that had provided for her, the gentleness that had respected her. She pulled her hand away, as if from a fire. "No, Jasper," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am not going anywhere with you." His charming facade finally cracked, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You ungrateful little fool," he hissed. "You would choose this filth. Over me, you'll regret this. I'll see to it that you both regret this." He turned, stomping off the porch, and practically vaulted onto his horse. He cast one last venomous look at Adelaide, then at Matto. "This isn't over," he snarled before spurring his horse into a gallop, kicking up a cloud of angry dust as he rode back toward town. Adelaide stood trembling on the porch, Hinto clutching her leg. The confrontation had drained her, but it had also solidified something within her. She had made her choice. She had chosen this wild, uncertain life. She looked at Matto, whose expression was grim. They both knew Jasper's threat was not an empty one. He had left, but he had taken the spark of conflict back to town, with him ready to fan it into a raging fire. Jasper Kane was true to his word. Within 2 days, the simmering hostility of redemption boiled over. He painted a lurid, twisted tale for anyone who would listen, the poor, abandoned woman, brainwashed, and held captive by a band of cunning savages who were using her as a front to encroach on town lands. He claimed the gifts were not payment for a debt, but a bribe, a sinister foothold. He preyed on their fears, stoked their prejudices, and presented himself as the town's righteous savior. The first sign of real trouble was when Mr. Abernathy refused to sell supplies to Kangji, who had ridden into town for salt. "We don't serve his kind here anymore," the storekeeper had said, his face pale and tight. Kange had returned to the camp, his jaw set in a line of cold fury. Matto received the news with a dangerous calm. "He wants a war," he said to Adelaide, his voice low. "He will use the townspeople as his soldiers." "What can we do?" she asked, her heart pounding with fear. "We wait," Matto said, "and we will be ready." The waiting was the worst part. Adelaide felt like she was living on the edge of a precipice. The Lakota camp became a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. The warriors checked their rifles, sharpened their knives, and kept a constant vigilant watch. They were prepared for a fight, but their discipline was absolute. Matto had given the order they would not be the ones to start it. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Adelaide was helping Winona grind corn when they saw the cloud of dust. It was not a single rider this time, but a large group, at least 15 men on horseback, riding hard from the direction of town. She recognized Sheriff Brody's horse in the lead, but he was not setting the pace. At the head of the posse was Jasper Kane, a rifle held arrogantly across his saddle. Matto and his warriors moved to the edge of the camp, forming a solid, silent line between the riders and the cabin. They did not raise their weapons, but held them at the ready. The posse reined in their horses, a stone's throw from the Lakota line, the air thick with tension. Matto Sheriff Brody called out, his voice strained. "We've come for Miss Callahan. There's been talk she's being held against her will." "She's not a prisoner." Matto's voice boomed across the prairie. "Let her speak for herself." Jasper shouted, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and malice. "Adelaide, come out and tell them the truth. Tell them how these animals have threatened you." Adelaide's moment had come. All her life she had been quiet, agreeable, a preacher's daughter who sought to please. The woman who had been left at the altar would have hidden, would have wept. But she was not that woman anymore. The prairie, the wolves, the boy and the chief had forged her into something new. She walked out from behind the line of warriors, her head held high, and stood beside Matto. She faced the men from her town men she had once hoped would be her neighbors. "I am in no danger, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I am here by my own choice." "She's lying," Jasper spat. "They've bewitched her." Adelaide fixed her gaze directly on Jasper. "The only person who has ever threatened me, Jasper Kane, is you. You abandoned me. You left me to starve. These people," she said, gesturing to Matto and his warriors, "saved my life and the life of this child." She stepped forward, her anger a hot, cleansing flame. "You speak of savages, I see only one here today. A man whose heart is so full of greed and pride that he would burn down the whole world to get what he wants. You are not the savior of this town. You are its poison." A murmur went through the posse. Her words, spoken with such conviction, had hit their mark. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, looking at Jasper with new uncertainty. Jasper's face turned purple with rage. He raised his rifle, pointing it not at Matto, but directly at Adelaide. "You treacherous witch! If I can't have you, no one will." Before he could pull the trigger, two things happened at once. Matto moved with the speed of a striking panther, shoving Adelaide behind him and drawing a long knife from his belt. At the same time, Sheriff Brody spurred his horse forward, slamming into Jasper's mount. "Kane, you damn fool!" Brody roared. Jasper's rifle discharged the bullet, flying harmlessly into the sky. Thrown off balance, he struggled to regain control, but it was too late. Sheriff Brody finally pushed to action, grabbed the rifle and wrenched it from Jasper's grasp. "That's enough," the sheriff yelled at the stunned posse. "This is over. This man is a liar and a coward. We were fools to listen to him." The standoff was broken. Jasper, disarmed and disgraced, glared at Adelaide with pure hatred, before yanking his horse's reins and galloping away, a lone figure disappearing back toward the east, banished for good. The rest of the posse, looking ashamed, slowly turned their horses and followed Sheriff Brody back to town, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in their wake. Adelaide stood in the sudden ringing silence, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Matto turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. He reached out not with his hand, but with 2 fingers, and gently touched the scar on Hinto's arm, who had come to stand beside them. Then he looked at her, and his meaning was clear. The debt was not just his, it was theirs. They had protected each other. In the crucible of that confrontation, standing between 2 worlds, Adelaide Callahan had not just chosen a side. She had claimed her own ground. The departure of Jasper Kane and the posse left a profound quiet in its wake, a silence that felt different from the loneliness that had once haunted the cabin. This was a silence of peace, of resolution. The tension that had hung over the plains for days finally dissipated, replaced by the gentle, ceaseless whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass. A week later, steeling herself, Adelaide rode into redemption. She needed flour and thread, but more than that, she needed to know if the ground had truly shifted. The town felt different. The hostile whispers were gone, replaced by averted eyes and the shuffling of feet. People still watched her, but now their gazes were filled with a mixture of awe and shame. They had seen her stand her ground, had heard her speak the truth with a voice that carried the weight of conviction. She was no longer the pitiful abandoned bride or the suspicious Indian woman. She was Adelaide Callahan, a force to be reckoned with. As she was leaving Abernathy's mercantile, a bag of flour tied to her saddle, Sheriff Brody approached his hat, held awkwardly in his hands. "Miss Callahan," he began, his voice gruff with discomfort. Well, on behalf of the town, I wanted to apologize. We let a man's poison get in our ears. We were wrong." "You did the right thing in the end," Sheriff Adelaide said, her voice even. She would not offer easy absolution, but she would acknowledge his final act of decency. "He's gone for good," Brody assured her, rode out of the territory. "Good riddance?" He glanced back toward the direction of her cabin. "You tell Matto. You tell him he's got a neighbor in this town should he ever need one." It was a small offering, but in the hardened world of the West, it was as good as a treaty. Adelaide nodded, a silent acceptance of the truce, and rode home. Her return was a return to life. The Lakota camp, once a source of fear for the town, was now the vibrant center of her world. It no longer felt like a temporary arrangement, but a permanent extension of her own home. The gifts that had once been a bewildering pile of debt were now woven into the fabric of her existence. The warm buffalo robes covered her bed, making it a welcoming nest against the cooling nights. The smoked meats and dried vegetables filled her larder, a promise of sustenance through the coming winter. The colorful woven cloths, a gift from Winona, became curtains that softened the harsh sunlight pouring through her windows. The cabin itself underwent a remarkable transformation. Led by Kangji and a few other skilled men, the structure was completed with a care and ingenuity Jasper's hired hands had never possessed. They showed her how to mix mud and grass to chink the walls, creating a perfect seal against the wind. The roof was finished not with crude planks, but with tightly layered sod that would keep the home warm in winter and cool in summer. They built a sturdy corral for her horse and for Tokahea, the goat, who had become Hinto's personal pet. Adelaide worked alongside them, her hands becoming calloused, her muscles aching with satisfying labor. She learned the rhythm of their work songs, the easy camaraderie of a shared task. The half-built cage Jasper had left her was being reborn, built not on broken promises, but on the solid foundations of mutual respect and communal effort. Her connection with Matto deepened in the quiet spaces between the work. It was a bond forged not in grand declarations, but in small shared moments. One afternoon, he found her struggling to turn the soil in her small garden plot. Without a word, he took the spade from her hands, and using his strength, broke up the hard, unforgiving earth. Later she watched him, instructing Hinto in the art of tracking his large hands, gently guiding his son's smaller ones, to feel the faint impression of a deer hoof in the dirt. He was a patient, loving father, a side of him that made Adelaide's heart ache with a nameless emotion. One evening, as she sat reading by the fire, while Hinto slept soundly on a pallet nearby, Matto entered the cabin and simply sat in the other chair, watching the flames. She offered to read aloud, and for an hour the cabin was filled with the lyrical verses of an English poet. He didn't speak, but his intense focus, the way his eyes never left her face, was a language all its own. In these moments, she saw the man behind the chief, a soul of profound stillness, deep loyalty, and a strength that was as much about listening as it was about commanding. The first frost painted the prairie in a delicate coat of silver, a beautiful, stark warning. That evening, Matto came to her as she sat on the porch steps. The air was crisp and the sky was a deep, star-dusted violet. "The winter comes soon," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to merge with the coming night. "The camp must move south to the sheltered valleys near the Stone Creek where the horses can find grazing." Adelaide's heart, which had felt so full and secure, clenched with a sudden sharp pain. She had known logically that this day would come, but the reality of it, the thought of the teepees being struck, of the laughter and the songs fading of the silence returning, it was unbearable. She stared at the horizon, at the familiar silhouette of the rolling hills, and nodded, unable to trust her voice. "Hinto will miss his teacher," Matto continued softly. "He carries your English words in his head, like precious stones." "And I?" He paused, and she felt his gaze on her. "I have grown accustomed to the sound of your voice, reading by the fire. This place will be too quiet without it." He came to stand before her, a towering figure against the twilight. "Adelaide Callahan," he said, speaking her full name with a reverence that made her shiver. "When you saved my son, you saved the future of my people. But when you stood against your own, you saved my belief that a bridge could be built. You have a brave heart. You have the spirit of a warrior and the gentleness of a summer rain. You have taken this wooden box and made it a tipiwakan, a holy home." He took a step closer, and for the first time he reached out and took both of her hands in his. They were large and calloused, enveloping hers completely, yet his touch was exquisitely gentle. He drew her to her feet. "I do not ask you to leave your world and join mine. I know I cannot fully join yours. I ask you to help me build a new one here on this land that now connects us. I do not offer you riches, you already have those, and they mean little. I offer you my strength to be your shield. I offer my heart to be your home. Be my wife, Adelaide. Be a mother to the son you have already claimed. Be my partner in all seasons, the one I ride beside the one I return to at the end of every day." It was not a demand. It was not a payment for a debt. It was a humble, heartfelt proposal from a powerful man who was offering her not just his heart, but his very soul. Tears welled in Adelaide's eyes and streamed warm and unchecked down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or loneliness, but of profound, overwhelming joy. She looked up into his earnest open face, then over at the cabin where their boy slept, and knew she was already home. "Yes, Matto," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There is nothing I want more." "Yes." He did not smile in the way Jasper had, with a flash of teeth and ego. Instead, the stern lines of his face softened into an expression of such deep, abiding peace that it took her breath away. He lifted her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of profound respect and devotion that sealed their promise more surely than any ring. Their wedding was a week later, not a ceremony of gowns and preachers, but one of truth and substance. It was held under the wide-open sky, witnessed by the silent, approving plains and all of Matto's people. Sheriff Brody came standing as her witness, his presence a symbol of the new peace. Adelaide wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, and Winona, her eyes shining, braided a single perfect eagle feather into her hair. "For vision and strength," the old woman had murmured. Matto stood beside her, not in the buckskins of a warrior, but the simple, dignified clothes of a rancher. He gave her a beautiful painted horse, a mare as black as a moonless night, with a white blaze like a lightning strike. It was the greatest gift a Lakota man could give a symbol, that she was his equal, free to ride by his side or journey on her own path, always his partner, never his possession. They stood on the land that had once been her prison, a man and a woman from different worlds, their hands clasped together, with Hinto standing proudly between them. They were not erasing the line that separated their peoples, but building a bridge across it, a bridge founded on courage, forged in fire, and destined to be their legacy. And so the story of the abandoned bride comes to a close, not with an ending, but with a new beginning, Adelaide Callahan, left with nothing but a broken heart, found everything that truly mattered in the heart of the wilderness. She discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. She learned that a family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build through loyalty and love. Her story and mottos became a quiet legend in the territory, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful futures are built upon the ruins of our most painful pasts. They proved that kindness is a universal language, and that a home is not just a place, but the people who make it safe. If this story of courage, love, and redemption moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of the untamed heart of the West, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Thank you for listening.